Well, now it's time to introduce you to our next speaker for today. I'm really excited to introduce you to Carl Prinz. Carl has a background that spans management, technology, energy markets as a CFO and CEO. It was during his time in his career in finance that Carl realized that global capital markets have the power to make a radical impact on decarbonisation by directing investments towards low carbon organisations. Seeing this opportunity to combine accounting knowledge with the power of technology, Carl co-founded Path Zero. He'll be talking to you a little bit about Path Zero today. Path Zero organises information to make it accessible through a SaaS-based platform so that businesses around the world can make an impact in our race to zero emissions. So today we're going to be hearing from Carl on the basics of how to measure your carbon footprint. And we'll also be hearing a little bit, I'm sure, about Carl's background and on Path Zero. So welcome, Carl. Really excited to have you here, and I'm going to hand it straight over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that kind intro. I'll just say thanks first to Amanda for that presentation. It's really inspiring always to hear from the Climate Council, and thank you so much for all the work you do. Let me quickly see if I can share my screen and get cracking. Right, so good morning. My name's Carl. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Path Zero, and we help companies achieve their climate goals through our online platform and the specialist consultants that we provide. And today I'm here to talk about how to get started. This all seems like a really big sort of nebulous issue, and there are things we can do, but practically, where do we actually get started? And this is really focused more for the kind of companies we are operating here. This is not Woolworths. This is more kind of mid-sized companies that you typically have in these startup portfolios. So perhaps a quick recap about what it is we're talking about specifically. So greenhouse gas emissions, also known as carbon emissions, result or create this change in climate that we're seeing, extreme weather, the kind of things that Amanda has highlighted in the previous slides. It's actually good to know that it's actually carbon dioxide, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, and a few others that really cause this specifically. So what is our part in this as a corporate? You know, it all seems, how do we connect that atmospheric issue to what we're actually doing? And the answer is that all the activities that we run as a business create these emissions. Those occur upstream from what we're doing. There are things that we're specifically doing. And then downstream from what our business actually does, our customers will also be using our products and services. So let's get practical and talk about the various scopes. Scope 1 is simply direct emissions. And the way I usually describe this is you're cooking in the kitchen, you're combusting natural gas in your frying pan, you're burning fuel that is directly emitting into the atmosphere. Other typical ones you may have in scope 1 is mobile combustion. So the easiest one to think about is a company-owned vehicle that runs on fossil fuel that emits as it drives. Some less obvious ones that we do come across in inventories we do is fugitive emissions. Usually this is the fluid that you put in air conditioners. Also, sometimes, you know, the natural gas that gets piped to your house, there's some methane that escapes there. Chemical processes are obviously less common for the kind of companies that we run. But that's really what scope 1 emissions are. It's the emissions that are directly under your control. Scope 2 emissions is generally electricity, and it's indirect. These emissions don't physically occur at your property, they occur wherever the source of generation of that electricity. And that's actually really important because there is a particular energy mix in any part of the world that you're located in, and the electrons coming to your premises are as green or not as what is actually being produced on your local grid. So with the renewable energy target, we've seen renewables come up to about 20% of the grid, at least here in New South Wales. And we'd certainly like to see a lot more of that coal-fired power being phased out of the grid. Then scope 3. So scope 3 is usually where people go, okay, well, this is all too hard, and maybe we'll just stick to our lane and not really try. But 80% or more of emissions generally occur here. It's emissions that are not directly under your control. You're not actually burning the fuel. But if it weren't for the operations of your business, these emissions really wouldn't be happening. So a couple of typical ones to think about for the sort of companies that we'd have here. Air travel is obviously a big one. Your staff commuting to and from work. With the advent of COVID, working from home is a new one to actually think about. People sitting at home just like I am right now, using energy and doing this presentation. Cloud services is another big one for us. You may think of all the electricity being consumed by those servers all over the world, hosting your website, running your applications, the food that we consume. And an interesting one actually is the professional services. And that really just shows how connected we all are to other businesses that provide services to us. So that is a quick Cook's tour of what is scope 1, 2, and 3. So as a business, where do we start? Well, at PathZero, we always recommend that people start with 3 steps. And the first one is to simply measure your scope 1, 2, and 2 emissions. Secondly, work out if you have any material emissions in your scope 3 that you should really be thinking about. And then step 3, consider the impact. So here is literally how you would measure scope 1 emissions. First, you'd have to work out what types you have, but then the way you actually do it, for example, for gasoline, is by determining what the quantity of fuel is that's being consumed and multiplying that by an emission factor. This is one of the simplest ways to calculate it. And those emission factors can be found in sources like the National Greenhouse Accounts Factors published by the Australian government. Generally, it's very important when you do this to know that you need to use a credible source. You want to use the correct year, as those emissions may change, and that these are regional. So as I mentioned with the carbon intensity of electricity in Tasmania, for example, is much lower than the carbon intensity in Victoria. So whenever you do these calculations, you could use a boutique consultancy or an online platform like PathZero, but whatever you do, make sure you get the right emission factors in. Then the next part is to consider material scope 3 emissions. And most of the time, this isn't actually rocket science. If you're an investment manager, you may think flights is usually pretty big, and then a lot of benchmarks you can look at to try to understand what types of scope 3 emissions are typical for your industry. Air travel for investment management can make up more than 75% of the emissions in one of these inventories. For technology companies, cloud services are often very important. And the tricky thing with scope 3 is that you can't just say, okay, here's an amount of electricity multiplied by an emission factor, and there's your answer. You need to potentially engage with your supplier or find out different ways to estimate what those emissions might be. We always encourage customers to actually reach out to their suppliers and see if they can actually find out more information directly. So for cloud services, for example, if you reach out to AWS and ask them, they may be able to tell you exactly what your carbon emissions are. Again, if you're thinking of doing this, you're going to need to find both a model, assumptions and emission factors that you can rely on. So we highly recommend you do some work on that prior to publishing any of this information. There's, again, a great range of very good consultants available and online platforms like PathZero. So once you've understood your scope 1 and 2 assets, scope 1 and 2 emissions, and the potential emissions in your scope 3, it's time to consider the risks, but also the opportunities that arise from that. So in terms of risks, one of the easiest things to do is to quantify it. So you put a price on it, $20 per ton, for example, and you'll be able to very quickly determine in your P&L what the impact would be if we did have a price on carbon. And if you find that your business, is not profitable anymore at that stage, or that one of your suppliers, one of your customers may have a real problem, well, that's something that you should really be considering as a business. There are also opportunities though, and that's probably one of the most exciting areas in this space, to actually be creating solutions that help your company and help other companies to decarbonize. So that is something that really, for example, changing an industrial process that stops the use of fossil fuel and uses more electricity or alternative means is really a great thing to go. Also, an opportunity side, the first thing people always look at is, well, if I drive efficiency in my energy use, I generally drive a cost efficiency as well. And that's definitely a big win-win for the business. We've had some really great examples of people, for example, considering whether they would use sea freight or air freight to ship their goods. And, there's a cost benefit, but also an environmental benefit of perhaps shipping it as opposed to sending it by plane. There's so many opportunities to talk to here that I think I could carry on for days, but I'll move on to the next slide. So if you actually understand the risks and opportunities, you can run your business in an informed way. And even if that means, you're 4 people in a co-working space, that right now this isn't a big thing for you, you are issue aware, so that as your business grows, you can actually ensure that you're putting things in place from the start. But if you run your business in an informed way, you can drive efficiency, you demonstrate this leadership, you certainly engage staff, you can attract capital. And on that point, that's one of the things that we as Pathsio really focus on doing here, is actually helping you communicate what you've actually learned to your stakeholders. More and more, it's becoming a requirement from institutional investors. Amanda referenced the flow of capital, to connect institutional investors to managers to portfolio companies. So if you are, like us, one of these portfolio companies, chances are you'll be needing to disclose some of this information to your managers sooner than later. And why not be on the front foot with that? Right. So we're fortunate enough to work with a number of fantastic clients, including Blackbird, happy to say, and Pathsio is working very, very hard to make this accessible to everyone. We feel that our personal impact, my personal impact, is to bring the skills taken from accounting and from other parts of our careers and bring it into this to say, well, you don't actually need to be in deep tech or provide the next massive technological solution. We can all bring our skills to do what we can. So making this information really easy to access and then be able to distribute is how we achieve our mission of decarbonizing the global economy. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I will hand back to the moderator.